Clarence Bradley. Nice to meet you, man. Nice to see you again, I should say. So we were just hopping off the intro conversation of hot tubs and AirPod Maxes for getting them at a steal at 150 bucks, which is such a wonderful win. When those little windfalls never seem to happen. But I was saying when we first met, it was one of my favorite stories that I still tell, of where you and I are on a plane landing in Palm Springs, and I'm stuck between these sweet older ladies that are talking about their sweaters, and like, oh, I love your sweater. I love your sweater. And where'd you get it? And I'm just sitting there, like, in the cramped, waiting to get off, like hurrying to wait, right? And they're like, Atlanta. And then because I'm talkative, I'm like, hey, I'm moving to Atlanta. And at that point, I hadn't met you. And then we get off the plane and we both go do our business to, after the landing and plane. And you're like, hey, I'm from Atlanta. And I was just like, no way. And then we just got to chatting, and both of us have a career in professional creativity and advertising and brands, and like just immediately had that overlap with New York and Atlanta, obviously, and just all of these things. And then we proceeded to have our first connection over ice cream, which is, again, to your credit, the most fabulous alternative to a drink or coffee that has ever happened or ever been proposed to me. And it's like one of those things that we just lost in the pandemic, is the ability to just like go get ice cream and talk. So anyways, one of my favorite stories. Very nice to have you in a working session with me. I like, quickly, before we even dive into it, man, like, I wanted you to recap for me, like, tell me about your path into creativity. Cause like, it's impressive, and you've been all over and you've become a leader in it. And I want to recap that real quick.
Sure. So when I was 15, I saw Spike Lee's second movie, which was School Days, and that made me want to become a director. So at that point, I knew what I was going to do going to college. Because up until that point, I didn't know. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And then when I got to college and started studying film, I had a roommate who was in the ad club and invited me to a meeting, and I told myself, well, this advertising thing could be a nice backdrop to film. And then by the time I graduated, I recognized the only people who had been building a resume while we were in undergrad were my friends from New York and LA. And I was like, okay, well, I can't afford to move to New York and LA and go to film school on top of that. So I started pursuing advertising, and started on the client side, and decided I was going to go to Miami Ad School, moved to Miami, and finished the Miami Ad School program, got my first job at BBDO New York, and I was kind of off from there. And I was very fortunate that my third commercial that I ever made was a Super Bowl commercial, and it was with Emmitt Smith, and it was fairly successful for people who love football. I mean, I don't think the average person cared anything about it, but because Emmitt Smith was in it, it was a big deal. And then, I told myself that I wanted to work for all of the people that I studied when I was in ad school. My background is copywriting, and the program teaches you to find people to kind of emulate until you find your own style. So I said, all these people that I'm emulating, I want to meet these people. I really want to learn the craft of copywriting from them. So I set out to work for all of those people, and that kind of guided my career. I wanted to go work for these. I chased the people, and more than anything else. And they were at great agencies, so I ended up working at a lot of great agencies for a lot of great people, and built a really strong network at a very young age. And that helped propel my career, because word of mouth goes a long way. And you're looking for a job, and people say, well, what about this kid? Is he any good? And and I was very fortunate that people thought highly of me, and I just kept matriculating through some really great places, and I had the opportunity to work overseas for a while. And I worked at a place called Creature in London, and then I worked at Apple for a period of time, and then from there I worked at Wine & Kennedy. And then I came back to the United States, and then I was given my first executive role at Kaempf where I was chief creative officer for about 2.5 years. And now I'm kind of freelancing and looking for my next big opportunity. And, we're both in Palm Springs, kind of hanging out. And so this is kind of a nice place to tread water. And so that's kind of my story.
Okay. You're definitely a copywriter if you use a word like matriculating. That's it's always, I remember in this project I was doing for this big chocolate company, I was doing a presentation and I used the word ubiquitous. And and the president of my firm was like, I had to look that word up, and I was like, really? I felt like ubiquitous was ubiquitous, like I felt in pure irony. But it's but it lent myself to that, like that larger discussion of like, okay, this is advertising, right? Is like, we have to speak the language of our audience ultimately, right? And like in product, like I switched from the ad side, right, and marketing other people's products and having an agency to having a product. And it's a totally different game. And it's lent me the value, it's lent me the perspective for the value of, I think, what really advertisers and great creatives did, right? Which was, it's so funny in how polarized the world can be when the ad and product world, right? You're sitting on the product side, you're like, agencies. You're on the agency side and you're like, product people. And you have this battle. It's a good battle. But being on the outside, it's like, dude, you got to learn the language. You got to talk to the audience. And back to the original statement, right? Because you were actually, when we met for ice cream, you were wearing that great Spike Lee, all of his characters and all of his movie shirts, which is phenomenal. Phenomenal shirt that you had that sweet couple like call you out, like, what is that shirt? But I feel like Spike was one of those guys who in his film and just always in his communications could speak like another, I don't know, I think it's what talented creatives do. Like they're speaking a language that we don't even know yet. Right? They're like talking. I mean, he was so forward thinking in his direction and communicating how he grew up in his neighborhood in Brooklyn and all of that, that it led to like developing an entirely new language that then, right, Nike adopted with the Spike and Mike campaign, which was brilliant in and of itself. And like, I'm wondering, like, how did you switch from that like fine art mentality of wanting to direct into narrowing it into, I want to advertise, and then obviously where you are now as an executive leader?
Great question. I think for me, it was just the ability to tell stories. And my viewpoint of advertising, when I was first exposed to it, was just this idea that, I can, instead of telling 2-hour stories, I can tell 30-second stories. And that has always kind of been my mindset. And whether it be in television or an out of home or print or what have you, you're still telling a story. And to your point earlier, it's about relating to people. That's one of the things that I do when I'm in meetings with clients, whether they be product people or salespeople or whatnot. I have this funny little thing I tell people. I said, you can't walk into a bar and start making out with people. You have to build a rapport with people. And that to me is what great copy does. It's like what great storytelling does. It builds rapport. It builds a connection. And one of the ways it does it, it catches you off guard. It makes you want to pay attention. I remember in '96 when Atlanta had the Olympics, we were hosting the Olympics, and I was driving to work, and there was a billboard on Highway 85 as I was driving into the city, and I pulled over. I've never done this in my life. I pulled over to the side of the road, and I stared at this billboard because it was so compelling. And it said, "You don't win silver, you lose gold." And it's just a picture of a track star. I don't know who the woman was, but it was a track star, and I'm assuming she was a Nike athlete. And
that was
Nike
FloJo. That probably was FloJo.
No, it wasn't FloJo. It wasn't
Oh,
FloJo. It was
really?
someone I didn't recognize.
Okay.
And I'm not, I'm not the biggest sports fan. So, but they had Nike was never an official sponsor of the Olympics. They just kind of like just took over the city with these billboards, and their approach to it was, we're not going to take this kind of like, um, gratiating approach that everybody takes to the Olympics of like, oh, we're just so happy to be here and to represent our country and blah, 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 blah. They took it from the voice of the athlete, and the athlete
Yeah.
is like, I did not train since I was 5 years old
Yeah.
to get to the Olympic team to lose. So everything was about that. They all had this very competitive tone. Another one, and this one had Jackie Joyner Kersee on it, and it said, "I'm not just happy to be here," you know. And I just loved those. I just love that language because it sparked a conversation.
Yeah.
It pissed some people off because they were like, oh, people should just be happy to be in the Olympics, but if you're a competitive person, and most sports, most athletes are very competitive people, it's like, no, I haven't been training all my life, getting up at 5 in the morning, dealing with issues of my body and all this other kind of stuff to come here and come in second. I
Yeah.
want to work hard. And I love that Nike took that voice and brought it
Yeah.
to the people. And to me, that's what great communication does, and that's what great storytelling does. Like, to your point, Spike does a great job of allowing you to get a POV of what it's like, especially if you look at Do the Right Thing. He gives you a POV of what it's like to be all the different ethnic groups in a community in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Whether you're Bangladeshian or Italian American or African American or Puerto Rican or whatever it is, he tried to tell that story from so many different perspectives. So you really get an understanding of what it's like to be, an American in these different communities. But that for me, that's what great storytelling does. It takes you outside of your own perspective and gives you a new perspective, and it causes you to pause. And it either, like I said, it either makes you laugh, it makes you cry, it pisses you off. But yeah, that's what attracted me to advertising.
That's awesome, man. I mean, like so many parts to unpack there. First and foremost, I'm right after this, I'm going to connect you with Nancy, who's one of my advisors at Everyday, because she was in charge of the 96 Olympics for Nike. So she's one of the great, she's just a phenomenal person in general. We met through happenstance through another project, and she came and like brought to this thing with all these other talented creatives, Salvadorian quesadilla, which is like a sweet, cheesy cornbread. It's so good. And I was like, okay, I just love this food, so I got to get to know her. But she turned out to be, I mean, she has been just a legend. Like her jersey is retired in the Wyden Kennedy building for what she's done. But we were talking about the 96 Olympics, and we were talking about the athlete actually like 2 days ago. Right. And I mean, I always keep a little notebook, but one of the things we were talking about was the athlete and putting that position. And I had kind of paraphrased a couple other Nike people that we're talking with that helped me out. And it was, that everyone's an athlete. That's kind of how we translated. She goes, actually, funny enough, she corrected me. She was like, this was never a forward facing thing at Nike. But the actual phrase that was internal, that wasn't advertised forever, was if you have a body, you're an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And we focus around that because we're trying to find every day our athlete, right? And I love that because of exactly what you talked about with copywriting, right? Which is it has to be provocative, right? There's that Kanye sampled the movie, I forget in which song, where he's like, it gets the people going. It's a movie sample. You know what I'm saying? It's provocative.
Mm-hmm.
But it's exactly that, right? And to the billboard, right? Of like, I'm not just happy to be here. I always think back on what's the phrase, like thoughts and prayers, right? People go on social media and they posture and they support this, that, my thoughts and prayers. It's like, shouldn't you go beyond that? Like, isn't there a more visceral experience? Shouldn't you do something? Shouldn't you physically be there? Like we this is getting into a larger discussion, which I'm going to narrow back to advertising creative, which is like, there's a very like armchair activist type of thing going on right now, where we're afraid to be provocative because it might elicit something else. But like the real action, when we get to the core of it, of how people really behave, is that like, listen, I've trained, like you said, I've trained my whole life for this. I'm not going to be happy to be here. Like, sure, am I grateful? Yeah, I'm grateful, but that should go unsaid. What I'm doing is I'm competing. I'm getting there, right? And I don't. It's one of those things, and I think especially in copywriting and advertising and products, and I think societally right now, where we are in a tricky place of wanting to say what we mean, but also being too careful about what we're saying, right? Too much based on what is everybody else going to think of me if I say something. Where I think you and I actually talked about this in when we first met, which is, I have this fundamental philosophy that I'm trying to bring into every day, which is we were talking about this us versus them concept, right? And I want you like put your teacher creative hat on here. It's like, we're looking at all these other brands, the Mac versus the PC commercials from the 90s, this just like polarizing sense of it's us versus them. And I was on with Greg Hoffman. We were discussing the brand positioning as well, and then Nancy, and then I was with Michael Hendricks, who was at IDEO. He was one of the managing partners at IDEO for a long time, and this was just, I think, on Friday. And they all had this great insight that like what we're building is actually more of a arena for all these competitors to come in. And instead of us versus them, it's us and them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's like embracing, and this is what we're still figuring out, right? It's not perfect, hence this meandering. But what we're trying to embrace is like you, right? Like Clarence, you are a professional creative. I was a professional creative, right? No, in some ways I still am. If you and I as copywriters came into the same room, or like one of your classrooms, right? You don't want me to acquiesce to whatever your idea is. You're trying to get me to challenge you and challenge the other people to come up with the best idea. So that wins, right? And that's the athlete idea. And so for us every day, and I want to talk about art school critiques, because I think they're the greatest thing in the world, by the way. But we're trying to figure that out, which is how do we challenge people by saying, no, we're putting an arena of ideas or 4 ideas out into the world so that you can take your favorite program and your favorite team and put them in one place. And that's where your ideas will thrive. It's not going to be thriving if you just have a prescriptive single way of thinking, single way of acting, single way of working, right? That's not where good stuff happens, right? Anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded reaction because you said so many things. And then there's the fact that I lived in where Spike grew up in New York. So I was like, I think our pizza spot was where the Do the Right Thing pizza spot was. It was on that same block in the kind of Clinton Hill, Bed-Stuy, where like Danny Simmons and Rosie Perez and all those people grew up most. And it was like, it was the most wonderful thing to, just walk around that neighborhood. But I'm curious, I mean, with all that said and this meandering, like when because you also teach adjunctly, right?
I teach at the one school, yeah.
At the one school, which is one of the most, I mean, I'm Pratt all day, go Cannoneers, but the one school is one of the most fabulous schools in the world for creativity. It really is. And I'm curious, right? Like when you get up and you are teaching students, aspiring creatives, right? Especially in this world, like how do you put them in the room and teach them both to critique other work and to accept criticism on their own work? How do you go about that?
It's a great question. The biggest thing for teaching, it's the same thing whether you're in the classroom or you're teaching young people in the office. They have to have an understanding of, and one of the things I think we're all guilty of is when we're writing something, we're kind of writing for ourselves.
Yeah.
And then sometimes there are situations where you're writing for yourself.
Yeah.
But when it comes to advertising, you have to recognize that you're writing to talk to someone. It's always a dialogue. It's always a conversation. You're talking to a person about a product or service, and I always have to remind them of that. And I always tell them, you've got to put a person in your mind. Who are you talking to?
Yeah.
Talk directly to that person.
Yeah.
You know, and like sometimes that person is like, if it's a feminine hygiene product, are you talking to your best girlfriend? Are you talking to, all of your girlfriends? Are you talking to a group of women in a life stage like early 20s, early 30s? Are you talking to kind of like the entire female gender about what it's like to have menstrual cramps or something like that? But you have to have someone in mind when you're talking, when you're creating something, from an advertising perspective. And I tell them, like, do that, and then be true in that conversation. Be honest about what it feels like. you know is it frustrating? Does it make you laugh? Are there things that you don't know about it that you wish you did know? you know and sometimes in the process of asking those questions, maybe the product or service that you have can bring answers to that, can solve those problems, those kind of things. But that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a way to make a connection. And that's the biggest thing that I try to teach people, is you got to make the connection with folks. Because I mean, a lot of people just kind of want to be creative for the sake of being creative, and that's fun and that's great, and I encourage that. But what we do is a commercial art, as they call it.
Yeah.
And we have to, and it's, advertising, I would say it's probably like 60-40. It's like 60-40 commercial, 40% art. It's like, at the end of the day, we're selling products and services. That's how we get paid. And you have to always keep that in mind. And so that's the biggest thing that I try to teach folks, is it's about that connection.
Yeah. It's such a good point, man. While you're saying this, I have like countless experiences of just observing that and having those aha moments, right? Like, we actually, funny enough, Nancy, who I brought up, was in that great, hilarious, cringeworthy movie, What Women Want, back in the day with Mel Gibson. And she represented the Nike team at the end. So she's in like a wig at the end, approving the thing. But that, like, if you remember the plot of that movie, the entire thing was like, he's a chauvinist, right? He is being replaced by somebody that, by a woman who speaks the language better and knows the products, and they're trying to win these other things. And he just comes with this just asinine perspective at first, because he's talking to himself. What would I want? Right. And the entire premise of the movie is him, like, being hit with a lightning bolt or something, and like realizing you got to flip it to do exactly what you're talking about. Talk about it from the other perspective. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just, yeah, I think it is so amazing. Actually, in a funny twist of coincidences to this conversation, I was in a room with Nancy listening to pitches of other businesses, and the product that the people were pitching was like a sports bra for women with larger breasts. And I was sitting there like, I have zero clue what this is like. I have no idea the problem set. And they were talking about all these things, and I raised my hand, right, because I do understand business, and I was like, hey, like, this seems like a very niche product, like, and it seems like a product that you're going to buy once or twice, right? Like, once, because it's sturdy, it's great, whatever. And Nancy, I think, raised her head and she goes, no, this is like a pair of jeans. As soon as you find your fit, you're going to buy that same thing multiple times, right? I had no clue. I still have no clue. But as soon as she said that, I'm like, ooh, that related it to me. And this is, again, to her talent. It's like, she was able to relate to me, my perspective, and connect it to the perspective of the product and the business and the person in a second. Right? I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
you're good at what you do. You're smart. That's really cool. But there's countless situations, and I think as you said, like as a professional creative, specifically as a student, learning that capability is so important. Now, like every day, so we're in the technology space. I've never even shown you our product, right? We'll do that at another stage. But one of the things that we set out to do was develop a better product for us, right? For collaborative teams and all that good stuff. But aside from the actual product and its solution, we were a couple of like, we had a bunch of art school kids on the team at first. Like the guy who helped us build out our technology and initial product infrastructure, he actually went to one school.
Oh,
He
cool.
also went to the Pasadena, and he started off in film. Now he's
Mhm.
the head of live sports at Amazon, right?
Nice.
Like and he's just doing all this tech stuff, and like, but we started off as art school rats, using the lessons of critique, first principles, boiling down on the technology and the product side to build this thing up. And it was we were laughing, and I would love to know, like in your classes, specifically in this age of remote learning, which I have no experience with, like the art school practice of burying your soul, of your creativity, right? You're coming as like a young kid who still thinks it's mostly art and less commercial, to your point, right? The 60-40 split. And you're bearing your soul on your idea and learning for the first time that this might not be good enough. And you have to do that amongst your peers. And then you also have to learn the practice of giving feedback that's constructive, not just critical,
Yeah.
not just tearing it. Like, how do you facilitate that? Like, I feel like that's one of the most valuable lessons that somebody can learn, but also the hardest to communicate to young people.
Yeah. For me, in a situation, what I always try to do is celebrate a person for their idea first. It's like, I see what you're trying to do here. You're trying to say this, or you're saying this, or this, that, and the third, which I think is smart. I think, and I celebrate them for their thinking.
Yeah.
And then I try to tell them, you know, for what you're trying to do, you need to be thinking this way, you know? So I never want to discourage them and think, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. It's like, no, like you're a creative person. You're going to come up with great ideas. And I want to see all of your ideas. I don't care how crazy or kooky you think they might be. I want to see them all.
Yeah.
And then what I'm going to do is just help you shape them and 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 to what would be a stronger piece of communication.
Yeah.
So that's what I try to do. I try to celebrate them for their idea, and then I ask them, um, at the end of the day, does this sell so and so? Like we just had an assignment where we were trying. It was through pedigree, and it was how do you get what's a new way of getting dogs adopted? Because what happens, there was a huge rush of
Yeah.
pet adoptions during the pandemic, and then we came out of the pandemic, and a lot of these dogs went back to the shelters.
Yeah.
And so we were like, so it's just kind of like any other product. It's, people get into the habit of getting something, and our product isn't changing, but we got to talk about it in a new way to get people excited about it again.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like, okay, how do you do that? And they had lots of really cool, innovative ways to do things with dogs. And I would ask them, I'm like, okay, but I said, this is a really cool thing you've created, but does it help dogs get adopted? And they go, oh, yeah. And they recognize that they kind of stray. They get excited about coming up with cool ideas. And and again, like I said, I take the time to celebrate them for their thinking. And then I say, okay, but does it get dogs adopted?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? At the end of the day, that's the end thing that we're doing. Like we had another thing for Squarespace, and this one really tripped them up because it was just the message was communicate to new entrepreneurs that if you're starting a new business, Squarespace is the best place to start. That's it. That was it. And they went off and they came up with all these new features and whatnot for Squarespace. And I'm like, you know what? I think some of these things are cool. But at the end of the day, all you're trying to say is if you're going to start a new business, Squarespace is the best place to start. Like, that's it. That's all you're trying to communicate. We don't need to add to Squarespace. That's the thing. And for some people, it's deflating because they're like, but I just want to be cool. And I'm like, we all want to just be cool and have fun ideas and stuff like that. I said, at the end of the day, we're selling a product or a service. How are you selling the service? And it goes back to what I was saying a moment ago. I tell them to start with the one-to-one. Who are you talking to?
Yeah.
If you start with who you're talking to, you won't stray. You know, Ernest Lupinacci is one of my mentors and just all around amazing copywriter and great person. He was one of the early employees of Wieden and Kennedy, great agency out of Portland, Oregon. And he created the Sports Center campaign. And he was telling me, he said, you know where Sports Center came from? He said, it was about having a conversation. You love sports? Hey man, we love sports. Let's talk sports. Yeah. And that was it. That's all the Sports Center campaign does. It's two people who love sports having a conversation about sports. And the idea is, if two people love sports, how would they envision what goes on in the world, in the walls of ESPN? Yeah. And it's just, and that's where the campaign comes from. And I just thought that was amazing. Yeah. And it led to some really amazing work. But yeah, that's the thing. We can't squash. I mean, and you could say the same thing about entrepreneurs. It's like, you can't squash their idea. You can't poo-poo them. You have to say, you know what? I think you've come up with something truly innovative here. Now let me ask you some questions about it. Does it do this? Does it do this? Is it cost effective? Is it so-and-so? Is it so-and-so? And those types of things are the things that shape us. That's where the education comes from. And it only makes us better. And, you know, going back to Melly Mel, it was like, only the strong can survive, you know? And that's the thing. It's like, if you're tough enough, if you're ready to learn, you recognize them, like, okay, well, these people are kind of making me better. And I have to understand that I have to listen to what they're saying, because they're not destroying what I'm making, they're making it better. Yeah. You know, and that at the end of the day, that's the mindset that I'm trying to teach. I'm like, I'm not poo-pooing your idea, I'm making it and you better. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that, man. I have this back to the copywriting and the meaning of the words that we use at the very beginning. You said, and I think deliberately you said dialogue. And I remember when I first came across like the differences between a conversation and dialogue, right? And the true semantics of it, right? Like the true breaking it down for its core meaning and etymology. And I loved the difference. And I always try to incorporate dialogue into the discussions, right? That I'm having with people, because a dialogue very much means that, like, it's about the positive moving forward for understanding, right? Versus a conversation is more of a competitive, I am trying to break down what you're saying so that I can get my point across more. Something to that. I'm probably screwing up a little bit. But regardless, you can see it from its roots, right? Con and dia, right? So this has been coming up lately because I feel like that part of the conversation of creating dialogue, of saying, hey, what you said, Melly Mel, I'm going to do common sense, right? Which is like, it was on the Like Water for Chocolate album. And he said, you know, just because I don't like it, that doesn't mean that I'm hating. And I love that line. I like that rings in my head, because I'm like, yeah, exactly. It's like, I don't have to tell you I like something. I don't have to tell you I agree to support you. Mm-hmm. Right. And you and I talked about this from the beginning. My current kind of, one of the current philosophies I have ringing in my head is that sometimes the most I guess compassionate thing that you can say to somebody is no. Right. And in what you're telling me right now, and like how you approach dialogue and teaching, it's very much that, right? It's like, hey, great idea, but no, it doesn't work for this. Right. Because you haven't considered these things or the other. Personally, man, like I always had a penchant for numbers. And so I was decent at analyzing these things. But in the creative world, where I took my agency, Like we would have people faced with like new products, getting innovation, getting ideas, and we would incorporate some kind of management consulting things, right? We would test out their ideas. We would prove out willingness to pay and do predictive analytics on top of the ideas, because I wanted to be that person for the other entrepreneurs that said like, hey, this is fabulous. I love the idea. I love the product, but I want to give you perspective on whether or not this is a viable business opportunity so that you can innovate. And we had to do it in one case with this guy who like started a successful business. He was like in landscaping, and he just had built this thing from like literally on his back, right? And then he invented this product and he got some people and they invested, but it was so expensive to produce. And it was such a niche market that it would take so much more than he was ready to do. And I said, like, and my response was, I think, very much in line, because I had teachers that did what you do, right? They taught me how to squash or like say no respectfully, constructively. And it was like, this is a great idea. These features are liked and people do like them. You are not wrong. But to scale this, you are going to need exponentially more traction in business and, you know, this, that, and the other. So you got to make some choices ahead. And it was interesting, man, because like his response to me was angry. And I had to very politely tell him like, hey, I'm not telling you what I think of your idea, like of what my opinions are. I'm telling you how the business can scale or not scale and what the predictions are. You can do whatever you want with that. But this is just the avenue. This is what I was hired to do, right? And I hope that educates you to help you shape those ideas in the future. And I think the dialogue idea of that is the best way, because it's the way to move on. And I have this other thing written down that while you were talking, because I, like all creatives and designers, right, our talent comes in trying to simplify grand ideas, even though we know that you can't oversimplify. And that's it. When I break down concepts and communication, I break them down into this idea of, it's a terrible acronym, FVMS. And it's, you know, the FUMS, which is frustration, vision, measures, solution. And it's what I always go through new concepts. And I say, first and foremost, identify what are people's frustrations. Like why do they need something new? Like what's getting in their way? The second is, where do they want to go? What is their vision for what an ideal future looks like relative to your product, your service, whatever? And it's like, and then third, how do they measure that? How do they actually measure that future, that beneficial future, or the lack of those negatives? And only then, and this is what I tell people, only then, once you understand that little journey, can you define a solution, right? Because if you don't understand that about the people that you're talking to, about, with, whatever, you're just being prescriptive. You're just telling them what you think, right? Because you have no and I'm curious, like, do you have shorthands when you're walking, like different ways of processing or ways of like looking at ideas that are just a shorthand, like a mechanism, or do you just kind of approach it on a one-to-one basis?
I think, I mean, there are definitely processes that you can follow that are kind of broad, kind of like what you were just talking about. And I think those are smart to have. But from a creative perspective, I think that sometimes, and I will say this, when you're writing a creative brief for something like that, you want to follow a process similar to what you're talking about. Like, you have to identify, what is the problem we're trying to solve? You know, what is the business problem? Is it awareness? Is it an introduction of something? Is it, what is it? What is, and then sometimes you have to even go deeper and say, okay, this is kind of a marketing problem that we're trying to solve. There's a greater business problem behind this. And maybe we need to solve the business problem and not the marketing problem. But it takes time for you to do that. And it goes to exactly what you were just talking about. Like, the marketing problem, sometimes it's just kind of, We've identified these things, like we put it in our little process and said, we identified these things, and this is the marketing problem we're trying to solve. But as a creative person, when you're handing that brief and you go off to your quiet space and you start thinking about it, and you're bouncing it around and you spend a few hours or days with it, you can come back to those people and say, you know what? I've done my research, I've been on the website, I've been, looking at some stuff, I watched some stuff, I've been throwing some ideas on the wall. And it seems like there's a bigger business problem we need to solve versus this marketing problem. Because but that's a case by case situation, because sometimes it is just a marketing problem, and you sit and you come up with it and you go and you play with it. But I think to me, that's kind of the difference between strategists and creatives. Like strategists, they can try to find that niche thing to help you go off and come up with ideas, but they are following its process. And it's like, this process tells us this, and this. We know this information. We know that. We know the numbers. We know the business cases. We know all that kind of stuff. And we created this creative brief to help you guys go off and come up with ideas. And creatives will take that information and then they do their own, cursory research. They go off and they look at some websites. They go listen to some YouTube videos and do this kind of stuff. They go on TikTok to watch a thing, this and a third, blah, blah, blah. And they start batting stuff around and they start jotting ideas down. And sometimes you stumble upon an idea based on that process. It's like, oh, here's an insight, or oh, here's a cool observation that could birth a great campaign idea. But then there are other times where you're like, you know what? We're not getting anywhere because we're not really solving the problem. The problem seems to be X. And then you can go back and say, you know what? You need to retool this brief because we're not really tackling the real problem. The real problem seems to be this. And we need to go back and have a conversation with the clients and say, hey, look, this is the real problem.
Yeah.
So I would say it's kind of there's a duality to it. I think you can follow a process. I can't give you one right off the top of my head, other than kind of like the way that, the typical creative research structure is like, this is the problem. We know this is our target. These are the hurdles. This is the one thing that we need to get across to people. Here's the timing and the budget.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the thing that we have on a brief. But like I said, sometimes in an individual scenario, you look at it and go, you know what? We're talking to the wrong people. Like I remember I had one assignment where this brand had been always talking to suburban moms. They'd always been talking to suburban moms, and they knew that suburban moms would never shop in their store unless they put out a Retail Me Not coupon. But they had information that said moms, in metropolitan areas shopped at their store all the time because they could walk past it all the time, and this and the third. They just had a different relationship with the store, and they would buy shoes to celebrate, getting a promotion or their kid getting an A on their paper or something like that. They bought shoes more frequently, but they never talked to them. And I just was like, that's the business problem you guys are having here. Like,
you're talking to the wrong audience.
Yeah, we just need to change who you're talking to. You know what I'm saying? Because, and it doesn't, and I had to explain to them, I said, it doesn't interrupt anything. Like, you can still send the coupons to the suburban moms and their practice won't change. But if you start talking to these mothers in metropolitan areas and showcase them and make them feel important and build a relationship with them, sales will skyrocket. And they did.
Yeah.
The only thing that pissed me off was that we didn't get enough credit for it. They didn't. And the only reason I bring that up was because we were trying to build a relationship with this client. Like, we were trying to say, hey, look, we're partners. Like, we're not a vendor, we're partners. We're trying to do this together. And it never really worked that way. They always were like, go do that.
Yeah.
So
that, and that kind of adversarial principal agent relationship is, honestly, man, it's at the heart of our product. Cause I got sick and tired of, I'm sure, things that you have ran into countless times. Like, we talked about the brief, right? Part of what Everyday started off as was fixing the brief process, right? Because we learned how to write creative briefs by ingesting good product or strategy briefs. And that largely has gone out the window for a lot of clients with existing relationships, you'll go through an RFP process that is exhaustive. And then it turns into this like, hey, I have an idea, come up with something in 24 hours. And you're like, on what? Right. And I think that is learning the brief and how to digest it as a professional in this industry is so critical, because you're going to go into a world that's much more freeform. That you're not going to have you're not going to have that luxury of always having the best information all the time. And you have to be able to individually think critically and then critique your own ideas for digestion by the other party. And it's the point that you made about the flipping the audience and understanding who you're speaking to is one of those, I think, very like human problems, like human behavioral problems that we ignore in our process, especially in creative and development, right? Which is you had a product that was being purchased, but by a certain group. But in the minds of the people that owned the product, they were selling it to a different group and frustrated why they didn't buy it, right? And they were so set in their ways. I come across, I have one specifically in my mind, but it's happened countless times where I've had a client with a product and they're like, no, I want to make this product X. And you're like, well, that's really cool, but without losing out on either thing, these people already buy it and they love it. So your best bet is to celebrate and innovate around that, and then let them relate to this other audience, right? And then you can solve it. And I had this very specific reason where we had this big company in the confectionery world, and they hired a leader that came in and wanted to revise a strategy to be more of like a casual, kind of cheaper but mass product. And because that's what they knew, that's where they came from. And like, that's great, good for you, like you did it at a great level, you're smart. But this product isn't that right now, and it's an evolution. And so when they kind of gave us an FU test, because I think they actually wanted to get rid of us because we had landed the business before the transition. And they gave us this product that was like a new flavor. It hadn't had anything. And I just leaned in and I was like, this is who buys it. I know it, this is the flavor. And they couldn't keep the shelves stocked. We sold out so quickly. And they're like, whoa, it was like, great. Well, you get the rest of the business. That was awesome. But then as soon as we went back to the products, because we went through this culling period that we survived, they wanted to still do the shift back to this other audience that didn't care a lick. And we kept battling, and we did successful campaigns, but we couldn't get past this transition to where that person ended up getting fired, and it was this whole thing that was going on. But we couldn't get past this transition. And maybe that's a failure on our communication process of like, hey, you're not talking to the audience that celebrates your stuff. And when you do talk to them, you're hamstringing it because you don't personally want it to be that.
Yeah.
And it was such a phenomenally, like, in my mind, this is one of the catalysts to me switching over to owning a product, right? And developing a product, because it's the test of, can I take the lessons that Clarence gives me, that Clarence has developed for me, right? But truly, like, the lessons from amazing people that have made a career out of doing this successfully, right? And take my own lessons and say, hey, can we develop a product with these same things in mind? Of, don't try to force the square peg into the round hole, and still try to create a product that is mutually beneficial for both the business and the customer, and it provides real value, right? Can we do that? And it's like, and it's the most thrilling, wonderful thing, but it's been the most frustrating thing, because I'm now on the side of like dealing with financing and, the whole investment community, dealing with strategy and product and all the hiring. And I'm learning this other great lesson of what it's like to be on that tail end, or not on the tail end, on the front end, right? Of like, oof, and then communicating and working with professional creatives is a whole nother thing. Hey, it's 10. Did you have something to jump off to?
Yeah, I have another thing, but I wanted to kind of piggyback on what you were just saying,
Yeah.
and then we can wrap. I The one thing that I've noticed, and I've only done kind of one entrepreneurial type of thing, and there's an old joke about the hardest thing you can do is tell someone that their baby is ugly, and and it really had more to do with business than it had to do with an actual child. It was just kind of like, you can't say to someone, your idea doesn't work, or your idea stinks, or da 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 da. And I think the biggest fault of a lot of entrepreneurs or brand people or salespeople or product people, whoever, we forget what we're doing. We forget who we're talking to. Like, you got to be consumer centric. At the end of the day, who is your end buyer?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, and I don't care if it's business to business or enterprise or whatever it is. Like, you have to remember that these are people. They're buying a product or a service from you. But at the end of the day, these are people, and they feel. And the thing that we have to recognize is people are irrational. We can have all the facts and figures in the world, but people are irrational. And that's one of the things I love about social media. Social media pulls that card for people all the time.
Yeah.
And God bless A/B testing for things, because you can go back and say, hey, look, you wanted this message. We told you this message would work. We put them both out there, and guess what? People liked this. And we're not here to say that we were right and you were wrong. We're just trying to explain to you. People want to hear from you in a much more humanistic way, or they care about this about your product. Like, you're trying to celebrate the fact that it's blue, but people care that it has two handles. You want to celebrate the fact that it's small, but people care about because it smells like cherries. Like, you got to do what the people want.
Yeah.
But for a lot of businesses, I would say businesses and sometimes individuals, they're like, no, we're going to turn the ship. And we're going to make people appreciate the fact that this thing has two handles. So what that it smells like cherries? These two handles, we've innovated and put millions of dollars into creating this thing about two handles. And I'm like, okay, let's step back, ask ourselves, if we want to talk about two handles, we've got to sit down, and that's a longer conversation we need to have. We can't just drop it out there into the world. And some companies will make the investment and say, okay, great, we're going to do that. I want to make the investment, and we really want to start seeding the ground for the importance of two handles.
Yeah.
But sometimes they're just like, nope, put it out there, and the people will appreciate it. We've got data that says that two handles make more sense. Put it out there.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I can say this. I haven't solved that yet. I've been doing this 25 years. I haven't solved that yet. I will say this. Steve Jobs, I was listening to one of his old speeches, and someone was talking about his mindset about, they were in a meeting with him and they were talking about research. And he asked them, said, do you trust the research? And they were like, yes, we trust the research because we got this. And he was like, no. Do you trust the research? He says, research gives us information about the past.
Yes.
We're inventing the future.
Yes.
How can we use research to help us prep people's minds for something they don't even know that they need yet? And you're talking about the iPad. Like, people thought, they were like, well, why would people want an iPad? And he was like, people don't know what they want until they have it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? That's an innovation. I mean, that's a visionary kind of perspective that that you can't translate to everything, or if you can, I haven't learned that yet.
Yeah. Well, Natalie, who I introduced you to, has a great point on this, because she's a creative and data person. And there's a difference between reactive, like A/B testing. How are people reacting to a certain thing, and how do we refine it to get them to X? And innovation data. And what you said is, paraphrasing Steve Jobs, is exactly correct, right? People will tell you all day what they want, and that's different than what they need and will buy, right? Because they don't know yet. right? And that's a very critical one. And there's, I mean, funny enough, and we'll wrap with this. Like yesterday on social media, right? I think I was on Twitter or something, and I saw a clip of Tyler, the Creator, who I actually met in an elevator evacuating a tsunami warning in Honolulu way back in the day. It was really random. We were in the same hotel in the same elevator, and I saw all those golf things. He's taller than I would expect, but I love the guy, and I really respect his commitment to his craft. And one of the things he was on, I forget the guy's name, nerdy dude. He always wears like plaid. And yeah. And he was doing an interview with him, and he's holding his albums, and he's like, they were talking about the music and the celebration of music. And he's like, he's like, at the end of the day, these guys will sell 2 records and they're unwilling to talk about the music. They'll go on, and I'm paraphrasing him, is they'll deep throat chicken wings and they'll go sneaker shopping, but they won't talk about the music and the craft and why they poured their heart and soul into this, right? And it's that lovely comparison between art and commercial art and what you're going to do to get the product on. But I think at the end of the day, what you touched on, Clarence, of talking to people and making sure that you always put the person that you're communicating with at the center of everything is the only surefire way of saying at least you're pointed in the right direction. Whether the idea is good, you don't know, but at least you're pointed in the right direction.
No, absolutely, brother.
All right, man. Well, Clarence, as always, thank you so much. I have some follow-ups that I'm going to do with you, but enjoy your day, and I'll talk to you soon. We'll get some ice cream here soon.
You got it, brother. I'll let you soon. Thanks so much for the time.
Right, yeah, bye. You too.